The morning mist hung heavy over Windsor Castle as Catherine stood by the tall windows of their private quarters. Her fingers traced patterns on the cold glass, while she watched the groundskeepers preparing the gardens below. Everything looked the same as always, yet nothing would ever be the same again. William entered the room quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He had been awake most of the night, sitting in his study and staring at official documents that suddenly felt meaningless. The weight of the news they had received yesterday pressed down on both of them like a heavy blanket. "The children are still sleeping," he said softly, joining Catherine at the window. His voice carried a tiredness that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. "Perhaps we should let them rest a bit longer." Catherine nodded without turning around. She could see their reflection in the glass. Two figures standing close but somehow distant, united in their sorrow yet each carrying their own private pain. The morning light caught the tears she had been trying to hold back since dawn. "I keep thinking about that last conversation," she whispered. "How normal everything seemed. We were laughing about George's latest school adventure, and Charlotte was showing off her new drawing. It was just an ordinary Tuesday." William placed his hand gently on her shoulder. He understood exactly what she meant. Life had a cruel way of disguising the most important moments as regular days. Nobody had warned them that their final goodbye would feel so unremarkable at the time. The palace staff moved quietly through the corridors, their usual morning routine continuing despite the heavy atmosphere. They had received word early that morning, and the household was preparing for what would be one of the most difficult days the royal family had faced in years. "The Prime Minister will be here at 10, William said, checking his watch. "And then, we'll need to meet with the Archbishop. There are so many arrangements to make, so many people to inform." Catherine finally turned from the window, her eyes red but determined. "I know we have duties to fulfill, but right now I just want to be a family. Before all the official business takes over, before the world watches our every move. Can we have just a few more minutes of quiet?" They stood together in the golden morning light, holding on to these precious moments of private grief before their sorrow would become public property. Outside, the world was waking up to news that would change everything. But inside this room, they were simply two people trying to understand how to say goodbye to someone who had meant everything to them. The phone on William's desk had been ringing constantly since 6 in the morning. Palace officials, government ministers, and family members all needed to be informed and coordinated. But for now, the phone went unanswered. There would be time for duty later. This morning belonged to their memories and their tears. Catherine walked to the small family photos arranged on the side table. Her fingers lingered on one particular picture, a candid shot from last Christmas, showing genuine laughter and joy. It had been taken just a few months ago, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since then. "We need to tell the children properly," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They deserve to hear it from us, not from anyone else. But how do you explain something like this to them?" William joined her by the photographs. "We'll find the right words. We'll tell them about love and memories, about how some people leave us but never really go away. We'll help them understand that it's okay to be sad, that being sad just means we loved deeply." The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across their room. Soon, their private world would be invaded by the demands of protocol and public expectation. But for these stolen moments, they allowed themselves to simply be human, to grieve without cameras or official statements or the weight of royal responsibility. They could hear the faint sounds of the children stirring upstairs. Louis would be the first to wake up, probably demanding breakfast and cartoons with his usual 3-year-old energy. George and Charlotte would follow, their school uniforms already laid out by their nanny. Normal life was calling, but nothing about this day would be normal. "Whatever happens today, whatever we have to face, we'll do it together," William said, taking Catherine's hand. "Just like we always have. Just like we always will." She squeezed his hand in return, drawing strength from his quiet certainty. They had weathered storms before, faced challenges, and celebrated triumphs side by side. This would be different, harder than anything they had experienced. But their partnership had always been their greatest strength. The clock on the mantel chimed 8 times, marking another hour closer to the moment when their private grief would become a public farewell. But for now, in the quiet of their room with the morning light streaming through the windows, they held on to each other and prepared to face whatever came next with the dignity and grace that had always defined them. Outside, the world waited for them to emerge and lead the nation through this moment of sorrow. But inside, they were simply Kate and William, holding each other up as they prepared to say the most difficult goodbye of their lives. The children's voices echoed down the hallway as they made their way to the breakfast room, their footsteps quick and light on the polished floors. George was explaining something about his history project to Charlotte, who listened with the patient attention of an older sister. Louis ran ahead of them both, his small shoes making soft padding sounds as he hurried toward the promise of pancakes. Catherine and William exchanged a look as they heard their children approaching. This would be one of the hardest conversations of their lives. Yet it needed to happen before the day swept them away into official duties and public appearances. They had agreed to tell the children together, as a family, in the comfortable familiarity of their breakfast room. "Mummy, Daddy." Louis burst through the door first, his face bright with morning energy. "Can we go to the park today? I want to feed the ducks again." George followed more quietly, already dressed in his school uniform, his hair still slightly messy from sleep. "Are we still going to school today? Jenkins said there might be special assemblies or something." Charlotte appeared last, carrying her favorite stuffed animal and looking thoughtful in the way that showed she had inherited her parents' careful observation skills. She sensed immediately that something was different about this morning, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. William knelt down to Louis's level, his movements gentle and deliberate. "Come here, all of you. Mummy and I need to talk with you about something very important." The children gathered around, their parents, their natural morning chatter fading as they recognized the serious tone in their father's voice. Catherine sat in the window seat, creating a cozy circle where they could all be close together. "Do you remember when we talked about how sometimes people we love very much have to go away?" Catherine began, her voice steady but soft. "Not because they want to leave us, but because sometimes that's just what happens in life." George's eyes widened slightly. At his age, he understood more than his siblings about the weight of such conversations. "Is this about great-grandmama?" he asked quietly. William nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yes, it is. Great-grandmama became very tired, and yesterday she went to sleep and didn't wake up. She's gone to be with great-grandpapa now, and she's not hurting or sad anymore." Louis looked confused, his small face scrunching up as he tried to understand. "But when will she wake up?" "When she visits next time. I want to show her my new Lego castle." Charlotte moved closer to her mother, her intuitive nature picking up on the depth of sadness in the room. "She's not coming back, is she?" she said, not really asking a question but stating what she had already figured out. Catherine wrapped her arms around Charlotte, feeling her daughter's small body trembling slightly. "No, sweetheart, she's not coming back. But all the love we have for her, and all the love she had for us that stays with us forever, that never goes away." The room fell quiet, except for the soft ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. William watched his children process this information, each of them reacting in their own way. George looked thoughtful and sad, trying to be brave like he thought a future king should be. Charlotte leaned into her mother's embrace, seeking comfort and security. Louis still seemed puzzled, the concept too big for his 3-year-old mind to fully grasp. "Will there be a funeral?" George asked, having attended enough royal events to understand the formal ceremonies that marked important occasions. "Will people come from all over to say goodbye?" "Yes," William said. "There will be a special service where everyone who loved great-grandmama can come together to remember her and celebrate all the wonderful things about her life. It will be sad, but it will also be beautiful, because we'll all be sharing our memories of her." Louis suddenly perked up. "Can I tell everyone about how she taught me to wave properly? She said I had to practice because people would be watching." Despite their sorrow, both Catherine and William smiled at this memory. She had indeed spent considerable time teaching Louis the proper royal wave, laughing at his enthusiastic but somewhat chaotic attempts. I'm sure she would love for you to remember that, Catherine said, smoothing Louis's hair. She was so proud of all of you. She always said you three were the light of her life. Charlotte spoke up quietly. I painted her a picture last week. I was going to give it to her when she came to tea on Sunday. Should I still finish it? Oh, darling, yes, Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. I think that would be a wonderful way to remember her. We could put it somewhere special, where we can see it and think about her. The children asked more questions, some practical and some philosophical, the way children do when trying to make sense of loss. William and Catherine answered each one, honestly but gently, creating a safe space for their children to express their feelings and confusion. As the morning progressed, the reality of their situation began to settle in. Palace staff appeared discreetly in the doorway, reminding them of the appointments and obligations that couldn't wait. The Prime Minister would arrive soon, followed by meetings with church officials and family members who needed to coordinate the many details of a royal funeral. We'll need to change our plans for today, William explained to the children. There will be many grown-up meetings and arrangements to make, but tonight, we'll have dinner together as a family, just us, and we can talk more about great-grandmama and share our favorite memories of her. The children nodded solemnly, understanding that their normal routine would be disrupted but finding comfort in the promise of family time later. They hugged their parents extra tightly before heading off with their nanny, who would help them process their feelings and maintain some normalcy in their day. As the breakfast room emptied, Catherine and William remained seated together, drawing strength from each other before facing the demanding day ahead. They had given their children the foundation they would need to cope with this loss, but they knew there would be many more difficult conversations in the days to come. The phone was ringing again, and they could hear the increased activity in the corridors as the palace prepared for the flood of officials, dignitaries, and media attention that would descend upon them. Their private family time was ending, but they had used it well, creating a safe harbor of love and honesty for their children in the midst of their collective grief. The staterooms at Windsor Castle had been transformed into a center of solemn activity. Palace officials moved with quiet efficiency, their black clothing a stark contrast against the ornate gold and red decorations that normally created such a warm atmosphere. Catherine walked through these familiar spaces that now felt different, charged with the weight of impending ceremony and national mourning. She paused in the doorway of the blue drawing room, where she had shared so many afternoon teas and family gatherings over the years. The room looked the same elegant furniture, the same priceless paintings on the walls, but the memories it held had suddenly become more precious because they could never be repeated. William found her there, standing quietly among the antique chairs and polished tables. He had just finished a difficult phone call with the Archbishop of Canterbury, discussing the delicate balance between royal protocol and personal wishes for the funeral service. His shoulders carried the visible weight of the conversations he had been having all morning. "The Prime Minister sends her condolences," he said, joining Catherine by the tall windows that looked out over the long walk. "She's coordinating with Commonwealth leaders and arranging for the visiting dignitaries. It's remarkable how quickly the world responds to news like this." Catherine nodded, watching as groundskeepers worked in the distance, preparing the castle, grounds for the thousands of mourners who would gather in the coming days. "I keep thinking about how private she was, how much she valued quiet family moments, and now her farewell will be one of the most watched events in the world." They stood together in comfortable silence, both understanding the strange contradiction of their lives where personal grief became public spectacle. William's phone buzzed constantly with messages from world leaders, family members, and palace staff, but he had learned to create these small pockets of calm amid the chaos. "Charles called again," William said after a moment. "He's struggling with the speech he needs to give tonight. After all these years of preparing for this moment, he says the words just won't come." Catherine understood completely. How do you summarize a lifetime of dedication and service in a few minutes of television? How do you express personal loss while comforting a nation? The balance between private son and public king was one that William would face himself someday, and watching his father navigate it now provided a sobering preview of their own future. "The children have been asking about the funeral arrangements," Catherine said. George especially wants to understand the protocol. I think it helps him to focus on the formal aspects rather than the emotional ones. William smiled slightly, recognizing his eldest son's coping mechanism. He's been studying the order of service like it's a school assignment. Charlotte asked if she could carry flowers, and Louis wants to know if he has to sit still the entire time. The image of their 3 children, dressed in their formal clothes and trying to behave perfectly during such a long and solemn ceremony, brought both parents a mixture of pride and concern. They would be watched by billions of people, their every expression and gesture analyzed and photographed. Yet they were still just children trying to say goodbye to their beloved great-grandmother. An equerry appeared at the door, clearing his throat politely to announce another visitor. The day had become a careful choreography of meetings, briefings, and consultations as the machinery of a state funeral moved into action. Every detail required approval, every decision carried historical significance, and every choice would be remembered and recorded for posterity. "The flowers have arrived from the royal gardens," the equerry reported. "The arrangements you selected are being prepared according to your specifications. The white roses and lily of the valley look particularly beautiful." Catherine had spent considerable time choosing the flowers for the family's personal tribute. Each bloom held meaning. The white roses for new beginnings and remembrance. The lily of the valley because it had been a favorite flower that reminded everyone of spring and renewal. Even in death, they wanted to celebrate the life and joy that had defined so many years. As they moved to the next meeting, Catherine caught a glimpse of staff members hanging formal portraits in the corridors. The castle was being prepared to receive thousands of mourners who would queue for hours just to pay their respects. The sight of those patient crowds, people who had never met the royal family personally but felt a genuine connection to them, never failed to move both Catherine and William. "I think she would have been amazed by how many people will come to say goodbye," Catherine mused as they walked toward the throne room where more officials waited. She always underestimated how much people loved her. William squeezed her hand. Briefly, a small gesture of connection amid the formal atmosphere. She knew, I think. Maybe not the full extent of it, but she knew she was loved. That's why she kept going for so long, why she never complained about the demands of duty. She understood that her life belonged to something bigger than herself. The throne room doors opened before them, revealing a gathering of dignitaries, church officials, and palace staff who had been working through the morning to coordinate the complex arrangements. Catherine straightened her shoulders and composed her expression, switching from private wife and mother to public duchess, ready to fulfill her role in this most difficult of ceremonies. Yet even as they entered the formal world of protocol and procedure, both Catherine and William carried with them the quiet moments they had shared that morning with their children, the honest conversations about love and loss, and the simple human truth that grief, no matter how public it becomes, always begins in the private spaces of the heart. The afternoon stretched ahead with more meetings, more decisions, and more reminders of the enormous responsibility they carried. But they faced it together, drawing strength from their partnership and their shared understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than themselves, while never losing sight of the personal love that made such service meaningful. Outside, the windows. The long walk stretched toward the horizon, where thousands of people would soon gather to be part of this historic farewell. Inside the castle walls, 2 people prepared to lead their family and their nation through one of the most challenging goodbyes in modern royal history. The evening light cast long shadows through the family's private dining room, as Catherine and William finally sat down with their children for the dinner they had promised that morning. The formal meetings had ended, the officials had departed, and for the first time all day, they could simply be a family again. The table was set simply, with their everyday china and no ceremony, creating the intimate atmosphere they all needed. George sat quietly, having spent much of the afternoon with his tutor discussing the historical significance of royal funerals. His young mind was processing not just the loss of his great-grandmother, but also his growing understanding of the role he would someday inherit. Charlotte had been unusually clingy all day, seeking extra hugs from both parents and spending time in the garden where she and her great-grandmother had often walked together. Louis, despite his young age, seemed to sense the sadness around him, even if he couldn't fully understand its source. He had been more subdued than usual, staying close to his nanny and asking repeatedly when they would see great-grandmama again. "Tell us about the white horses," Charlotte said as they began their meal. She had always been fascinated by the ceremonial aspects of royal events, and focusing on these details seemed to help her cope with the more difficult emotions. William smiled at his daughter's request. "Well, they're very special horses called Greys, even though they look white. They've been trained for years to pull the state carriages, and they know how to walk very slowly and solemnly during important ceremonies." "Will they be sad too?" Louis asked, his 3-year-old logic trying to make sense of whether animals could understand the significance of human grief. "I think they'll know that something important is happening," Catherine said gently. "Animals are very good at sensing when people are feeling strong emotions. They'll be very dignified and respectful, just like everyone else will be." George looked up from his plate, his expression serious beyond his years. "Papa, will you have to give a speech? I heard you talking to someone about readings and tributes." William nodded, his own dinner barely touched as he focused on his children's needs. "Yes, I'll need to speak about great-grandmama and what she meant to our family and to the country. It's one of the most important speeches I've ever had to give." "What will you say?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious about how her father would find words for something so big and sad. "I'll talk about her kindness, her sense of duty, and how much she loved all of us," William replied. "I'll tell people about the grandmother who taught you how to wave, Louis, and who listened to all of Charlotte's stories about school, and who was so proud when George learned to ride properly." Catherine watched her husband navigate these difficult conversations with their children, marveling at his ability to make complex adult responsibilities understandable and less frightening for young minds. She knew he was drawing on his own childhood experiences, remembering how his father had explained similar situations to him when he was George's age. "Will we all ride in the big carriage?" Louis asked, his excitement about the horses temporarily overriding his confusion about the sad occasion. "We'll be part of the procession," Catherine explained. "But remember, this is a very serious and solemn occasion. People will be watching to see how our family says goodbye, and we want to show them that even when we're very sad, we can be dignified and respectful." The conversation continued as they finished their simple dinner, the children asking questions that ranged from practical concerns about what they would wear to deeper wonderings about where people go when they die, and whether great-grandmama could still see them somehow. After the children were settled with their bedtime stories and tucked into their beds, Catherine and William found themselves alone again in their sitting room. The day had been exhausting, filled with decisions and arrangements that felt surreal in their magnitude. Now, in the quiet of evening, they could finally process what lay ahead. "I keep thinking about the speech," William said, holding the notes he had been working on throughout the day. "How do you capture 96 years of life in 10 minutes? How do you speak for a nation's grief while dealing with your own?" Catherine curled up beside him on the sofa, reading over the draft he had been writing and rewriting. "You speak from your heart," she said simply. "You tell the truth about who she was, not just as a queen, but as a person. People don't need perfect words. They need honest ones." They worked together on the speech, Catherine offering gentle suggestions and William sharing memories that brought both laughter and tears. The television played softly in the background, showing news coverage of the preparations taking place. Across the country, flags were flying at half-mast, people were leaving flowers at palace gates, and crowds were already beginning to gather along the funeral route. "Look at all those people," Catherine said, gesturing toward the screen where aerial shots showed thousands of mourners camping out overnight to secure good viewing positions. She would have been so surprised by this outpouring of love. William looked up from his notes, watching the footage of ordinary people who had traveled from across the kingdom just to be present for this farewell. I think it would have touched her deeply. She always wondered if she was doing enough, if people really understood how much she cared about serving them. As the evening grew later, they began discussing the more personal aspects of the next few days. How to help the children through the long ceremony, how to balance their own grief with their public responsibilities, how to find moments of private Reflection amid the intense media attention and official obligations. After tomorrow, everything will be different, Catherine said quietly. Not just for us, but for the whole country. It's the end of an era in so many ways. William set aside his speech and took her hand. But it's also the beginning of something new. She prepared us for this moment, even when we didn't realize that's what was happening. All those years of guidance and example, they were her way of making sure we'd be ready. They sat together in comfortable silence, drawing strength from each other as they had throughout their marriage. Tomorrow would bring one of the most challenging days of their lives, but they would face it together, supported by their love for each other and their commitment to honoring the legacy they had inherited. The last item on William's schedule was a private call to his father, who was spending his own final evening before taking on the full weight of kingship. Both men would face the world tomorrow changed forever, carrying new responsibilities that had been passed down through generations of their family. Outside their windows, Windsor Castle stood quiet and dignified in the darkness, ready to host one of the most significant ceremonies in modern British history. Inside, a family prepared for their most difficult goodbye, holding on to each other and the love that would carry them through whatever tomorrow would bring. The morning of the funeral dawned clear and cold, with autumn sunlight filtering through the frost-covered windows of Windsor Castle. Catherine had woken before sunrise, unable to sleep as her mind raced through the day ahead. She found herself standing once again by the window, watching as the final preparations took place in the courtyard below. Security personnel moved with quiet efficiency. Television crews positioned their cameras, and the first early mourners began to gather behind the barriers. William was already dressed in his formal military uniform, the medals and decorations weighing heavily not just on his chest but on his heart. He moved through their private rooms with the careful deliberation of someone mentally rehearsing the day's events, checking and double-checking details that had been planned down to the minute. The children were being helped into their formal clothes by their nanny, their usual morning energy subdued by the gravity of the occasion. George stood perfectly still as his tie was adjusted, his young face set in serious lines as he prepared to fulfill his role in the most important ceremony he had ever attended. Charlotte held her small bouquet of flowers tightly, the white roses, trembling slightly in her nervous hands. Louis, despite his young age, seemed to understand that this was no ordinary day, staying unusually quiet and cooperative. "Are you ready for this?" Catherine asked William as they met in their dressing room, both of them checking their appearance one final time before joining the formal procession that was already assembling in the castle's main courtyard. William paused in adjusting his ceremonial sword, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "I don't think anyone can ever be truly ready for something like this. But we have each other, and we have the children, and we have the strength she gave us over all these years. That will have to be enough." The sound of horses' hooves echoed off the cobblestones as the ceremonial carriages took their positions. The gun carriage that would carry the coffin stood waiting, draped in the royal standard and surrounded by military honor guards who had practiced their movements countless times. Everything was precise, dignified, and heavy with the weight of centuries of tradition. Catherine helped Louis into the carriage that would carry their family, making sure he was secure and comfortable for the long journey ahead. Charlotte sat beside her mother, clutching her flowers and watching the crowds through the carriage windows with wide, solemn eyes. George sat next to his father, his posture straight and formal as he had been taught, but his hand occasionally reaching out to touch William's arm for reassurance. The procession began to move through the castle gates and onto the long walk, where thousands of people stood 10 deep behind barriers, many of them having waited through the cold night for this moment. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic sounds of horses' hooves and the measured steps of the military bands. Catherine watched the faces in the crowd as they passed, seeing tears on many cheeks and flowers being thrown gently in their path. People of all ages had come to pay their respects, elderly veterans standing at attention, young families lifting children onto shoulders for a better view, students who had traveled from universities across the country. The outpouring of love and respect was overwhelming in its sincerity. "Look, Mama," Charlotte whispered, pointing to a group of children from a local school who were holding handmade signs and drawings. They made pictures for great-grandmama. Catherine smiled through her tears, touched by the way their personal loss had become a moment of national unity. These children, who had never met their great-grandmother personally, had been moved to create art and write messages as their way of saying goodbye. It was exactly the kind of gesture that would have deeply moved the woman they were honoring. As they approached Westminster Abbey, the scale of the ceremony became even more apparent. World leaders, royal families from across the globe, and representatives from every Commonwealth nation had gathered to pay their final respects. The abbey itself looked magnificent and solemn, decorated with white flowers and filled with the soft glow of hundreds of candles. William helped his family from the carriage, each movement slow and deliberate under the gaze of cameras and the eyes of history. George walked beside his father with careful steps. Charlotte held tight to her mother's hand, and Louis was carried by William, his small face serious as he tried to understand the magnitude of what was happening around him. Inside the abbey, the atmosphere was hushed and reverent. The ancient stones seemed to absorb the collective grief of the 2,000 mourners who filled every pew. Catherine found herself looking up at the soaring arches and stained glass windows, thinking about all the royal ceremonies these walls had witnessed over the centuries. This funeral would join that long history of significant moments that had shaped the nation. The children sat between their parents in the front row, their small figures almost lost among the formal grandeur, but somehow representing the future that their great-grandmother had spent her life serving. Charlotte placed her flowers on the step before their pew, a simple gesture that would be remembered by everyone who witnessed it. As the service began, William reached for Catherine's hand, drawing strength from her steady presence beside him. They had prepared for this moment, rehearsed their roles, and steeled themselves for the emotional weight of saying this final goodbye. But nothing could have fully prepared them for the reality of sitting in that ancient abbey, surrounded by the representatives of nations and empires, bidding farewell to the woman who had been the cornerstone of their family and their country. The music swelled through the abbey, voices raised in hymns that had comforted mourners for generations. Catherine closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to remember private family moments, quiet conversations, shared laughter, gentle advice given with infinite patience and love. These memories would outlast all the ceremony and protocol, remaining as the true legacy of a life well lived. When it came time for William to deliver his tribute, he rose from his seat with quiet dignity, his speech carefully folded in his hand, but his heart full of words that no formal address could fully capture. As he approached the lectern, Catherine watched him with pride, knowing that he would find the perfect balance between personal grief and public leadership, honoring both, his role as a grandson and his duty as a future king. William stood at the lectern, looking out over the sea of faces that filled Westminster Abbey. For a moment, the magnitude of the occasion threatened to overwhelm him. The weight of history, the eyes of the world, the responsibility of speaking for a nation's grief. But then he saw Catherine's encouraging smile from the front pew, saw his children sitting so bravely despite their young ages, and found his voice. "Today we gather not just to mourn a queen, but to celebrate a grandmother," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ancient stones. She was both of these things completely, the sovereign who served with unwavering dedication for 7 decades, and the family matriarch who taught us that true nobility lies in how we treat others, especially when no one is watching. The words flowed from his heart rather than just from the paper in his hands. He spoke about bedtime stories and gentle corrections, about the way she had listened patiently to George's excited accounts of school projects and Charlotte's elaborate plans for her future career as a veterinarian. He shared how she had spent countless minutes teaching Louis the proper way to wave, laughing at his enthusiastic attempts and praising his eventual success. Catherine watched her husband transform his private grief into public healing, offering the congregation and the millions watching around the world a glimpse of the woman behind the crown. His words painted a picture of someone who had balanced the demands of duty with the warmth of genuine affection, who had never forgotten that her greatest privilege was not ruling over subjects, but serving alongside fellow human beings. She taught us that leadership is not about commanding respect, but earning it through consistent kindness and reliability. William continued. She showed us that the heaviest crown becomes bearable when worn in service to others. And perhaps most importantly, she demonstrated that even in the most formal and public aspects of royal duty, it is possible to remain completely, authentically human. George listened to every word his father spoke, his young mind recording not just the content, but the way William managed to honor both his personal relationship and his public role. This was a lesson in leadership that no textbook could provide, a real-time demonstration of how to carry the weight of tradition while speaking with genuine emotion. Charlotte held her mother's hand throughout the tribute, occasionally whispering questions that Catherine answered with gentle whispers. When William spoke about their great-grandmother's love of gardens and animals, Charlotte nodded knowingly, remembering the countless afternoon walks they had shared among the flowers at Windsor. As William concluded his remarks and returned to his seat, the abbey fell into a profound silence. The archbishop rose to deliver the final blessing, his ancient words carrying across centuries of tradition and faith. The formal ceremony was drawing to a close, but the emotional journey was far from over. The final hymn filled the abbey with voices raised in unity, 2,000 people singing together in a moment that transcended political differences, social divisions, and national boundaries. Catherine found herself thinking about how music had always been important to their family gatherings, how their great-grandmother had insisted on singing traditional songs during holidays and celebrations. When the service ended, the family followed, the coffin as it was carried from the abbey by military pallbearers. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable, this final procession marking the end of an era that had defined not just their family, but their entire nation. Catherine kept one hand on Charlotte's shoulder and the other reaching for Louis, making sure her children felt supported through these overwhelming moments. Outside the abbey, the November air was crisp and clear. The streets were lined with mourners as far as the eye could see, people who had waited hours just to be part of this historic farewell. Many were crying openly, their grief genuine, despite having never met the woman they were mourning. The sight of these ordinary people, united in their respect and sadness, provided a powerful reminder of the connection between the royal family and the nation they served. The journey to Windsor for the private burial seemed to pass both too quickly and too slowly. Catherine watched the countryside roll by through the carriage windows, thinking about all the times they had made this journey for happier occasions, family celebrations, holiday gatherings, quiet weekends away from the pressures of official duties. George sat quietly throughout the ride, processing everything he had witnessed. At 10 years old, he was beginning to understand the weight of the inheritance that would someday be his, seeing firsthand how personal loss becomes public ceremony when you are born into royal responsibility. Yet his parents' example was teaching him that it was possible to fulfill these duties with grace while maintaining genuine human emotion. Charlotte had dozed off against her mother's shoulder, exhausted by the intensity of the day. Even in sleep, she clutched the small memorial card from the service, holding on to this tangible reminder of their farewell. Louis played quietly with a small toy, his 3-year-old resilience helping him bounce back from the solemnity of the morning. At Windsor, the final private ceremony was limited to close family members. This intimate gathering felt completely different from the grand public funeral. Here they could simply be grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and devoted family members saying their personal goodbyes without the weight of cameras and protocol. William spoke again, this time informally and from the heart, sharing memories that belonged only to their family. He talked about Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations, about quiet conversations and gentle advice that had shaped all of their lives. Catherine added her own remembrances, speaking about the woman who had welcomed her into the family with warmth and patience, who had become not just a grandmother-in-law but a genuine friend and mentor. The children each placed a flower on the grave, their small gestures more meaningful than any formal tribute. George stood at attention briefly, showing the respect he had been taught, then relaxed into his father's embrace. Charlotte whispered something that only she and her great-grandmother would ever know. Louis simply said, "Goodbye," in his clear, innocent voice. As the sun set over Windsor Castle, the family walked back through the gardens where so many happy memories had been made. The day of official mourning was over, but the process of learning to live with this loss was just beginning. They would return to their regular routines, their public duties, and their private family life, but everything would be colored by the absence of the woman who had been the cornerstone of their world. That evening, back in their private quarters, Catherine and William tucked their children into bed with extra care. The day had been emotionally exhausting for everyone, but it had also been a powerful demonstration of how families can support each other through the most difficult times. "Did we do okay today?" Charlotte asked sleepily as her mother pulled the covers up to her chin. "You were perfect," Catherine assured her. "Great-grandmama would have been so proud of how brave and dignified you all were." Later, as Catherine and William finally had a moment alone together, they reflected on the day that had changed everything. They had successfully navigated one of the most challenging experiences any family can face, doing so under the intense scrutiny of global media while maintaining their dignity and honoring their personal grief. "It's over," William said quietly, holding Catherine close as they stood once again by their bedroom window, looking out over the castle grounds that now seemed both familiar and forever changed. "No," Catherine replied softly. "It's not over. It's different now, but the love continues. The memories continue. The lessons she taught us continue. Today wasn't an ending. It was a transformation." Outside their window, Windsor Castle stood peacefully in the moonlight, ready to continue its centuries-long role as home to the royal family. Inside, two people who had just said the most difficult goodbye of their lives held each other close, drawing strength from their love and their shared commitment to honoring the legacy they had inherited. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but they would face them together, carrying forward the wisdom and grace that had been passed down to them through generations of service and dedication. The quiet goodbye had become a public farewell that touched millions of hearts around the world, but in the end, what mattered most was the private love that remained, the family bonds that death could not break, and the continuing story of service that would define their lives for years to come.